What's up, guys? Jared here. Paul Thomas Anderson's Licorice Pizza finally came out here in Helsinki, and so although I'm a little late to the party, I wanted to weigh in with my thoughts just in time for the Oscars. First, I'm going to give my opinion on the film, and then, since it's YouTube after all, and I know you wonderful degenerates love a good spectacle, I'm going to offer my thoughts on the two big controversies surrounding the film, because after all, the platform is the message, and sometimes the algorithm demands a little blood. So, the movie is good. In fact, it's so good. I think that with this movie, Paul Thomas Anderson solidifies his stature as one of the great visionaries of our time. And in some ways, I think that what he achieves with this movie is much more impressive than a lot of the celebrated films of his contemporaries like Tarantino and Fincher and so on. See, creating a plot-centric film in the vein of Christopher Nolan is outrageously difficult. You have to have razor-sharp precision in pacing, editing, performance, etc., to ensure that you build tension, the tension is maintained, and ultimately the movie comes to a satisfying narrative conclusion. As monumentally difficult as this is to pull off, there is somewhat of a science to it, or at least a soft science. I mean, in Hollywood there are script doctors that can apply certain standards to a script to give it a better chance of keeping the audience engaged and satisfied. I mean, you can read the script for The Dark Knight and the tension is just there, and you can feel it before seeing anything on a screen. What makes a piece like Licorice Pizza so brave and impressive is that it doesn't have the privilege of being able to rely on any of these so-called soft sciences. The whole movie is basically a series of relatively arbitrary events that form the background of the budding relationship between Alana and Gary. The film's appeal is in its ability to capture a moment. There's nothing to really get. It essentially amounts to a collection of events that evoke feelings that cumulatively build to a sublime, ephemeral, and ecstatic eruption of love and passion. And there's no science to that. You can't read the script for Licorice Pizza and know that it's going to work. You can't read the script and get that feeling of young, hopeful love that the movie does so well in communicating. It requires blind faith in Anderson's vision, blind faith in the actor's chemistry, and blind faith that when all these scenes come together, it will produce an emotional response. It's like a song. You can't read the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven and know that it's going to be a good song. You have to hear the song, at least in some form. And since you can't really, quote, hear the song when it's a movie until tens of millions of dollars have been spent filming the thing, it's such an admirable risk when something like this is undertaken, and such an incredible gift and such an impressive thing when it works. I think in some ways it might be more appropriate to think of Paul Thomas Anderson as a kind of cinematic songwriter, especially when you consider how central music has been in inspiring and crafting his works. I mean, from his collaborations with Ryan Adams and Amy Mann, to his relationship with Fiona Apple, to his incredible working relationship with Johnny Greenwood, he's always been operating on a kind of musical wavelength. Speaking of which, you can see that PTA has found a new muse in singer-songwriter Alana Haim, or Haim, just like he did previously with Amy Mann and Fiona Apple. She's basically PTA's type. Dude loves himself some singer-songwriters. And the camera really falls in love with her. The way he shoots Alana really shows his appreciation of her unique beauty and personality, and that ability to immerse the audience in his subjectivity is paramount for something like this to work. PTA loves both Cooper Hoffman and Alana Haim, and it's evident in every frame of this movie, and it's contagious. So, needless to say, Alana Haim and Cooper Hoffman are sublime. I can only hope that their future roles are captured by filmmakers who are as intimately appreciative of their talents. Basically, this whole movie amounts to PTA's passions in celluloid form. It takes place in the Valley, where he grew up. It's jam-packed with references to 70s Hollywood, the industry that he grew up in. It's basically a testament to cinema's unique ability to portray and immerse an audience in an artist's subjectivity. Lastly, I just want to mention that this is really one of the funniest movies of 2021. I mean, from Sean Penn's super pretentious William Holden impression, to John Michael Higgins' idiotic restaurateur, to Bradley Cooper as the ultimate Hollywood douchebag, to the painfully awkward Shabbat dinner with an avowed atheist. I mean, it's quite possibly the funniest movie of the year. I found myself laughing out loud a lot. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the controversies surrounding the film. And if you watch my Twitch stream, you've likely heard me say on many occasions that we need not only be mindful in the way that we express things, but also mindful in the way that we interpret things, because communication is a two-way street, and too often responsibility is laid entirely at the feet of the subject that is expressing something, and none at the person who is interpreting something. And it's from this general posture that I'll be talking about these controversies. So the first controversy is the age discrepancy between our two lovers. Alana is 25 and Gary is 15. Is this irredeemably creepy? So while we have many laws in the West that would prevent or seek to prevent a relationship like this from happening, I think it's important for us to take a step back and ask two things. One, what are these laws seeking to protect or prevent? And two, to what extent is it permissible for entertainment to portray people breaking certain laws? Regarding laws protecting minors, their purpose is to protect individuals who aren't yet mature from making decisions that can negatively affect their development, or they are used to protect them from the influence of more mature individuals that might take advantage of their impressionable state. Now, although we'd like to live in a utopia where we can judge the nuance of each individual scenario, we don't. And so the line is drawn around age, as age is often a good proxy for emotional and intellectual maturity. But of course, this isn't perfect. As we all know, at least one man-child or some extremely mature young person. So taking that into consideration, it's pretty clear that those concerns have no foundation in the story being told here. Despite being 15 years old, Gary is extremely mature, likely due to his absent father and the role he has to fill in supporting his mother. Like many young men in single-mother households, his maturity accelerated due to his increased responsibility in the household. I mean, Gary owns and builds his own businesses, he conducts deals with a level of confidence that most adults will never achieve, and he handles conflict like someone much older and wiser than him. He is functionally more mature than Alana, so there's no real concern that the film is promoting relationships in which a minor is being harmed or taken advantage of. But if you're still offended, you might say, screw the nuance, people might not even see the film, and the very premise may communicate the wrong message. Fine. But I don't see anyone complaining about characters transgressing other laws that are just as serious, and sometimes those movies or TV shows portray this transgression of the law with much less quote-unquote responsibility. For example, selling drugs in Breaking Bad, murdering people in Dexter, or creating crime organizations in classics like The Godfather and Goodfellas. I mean, a much stronger argument could be made that these stories are valorizing the breaking of these very essential, critical, and important laws, yet nobody seems to be upset. Obviously, I'm not saying that we should be outraged at all of these things, and if we were to say that immoral acts shouldn't be portrayed on film, then that would be pretty much the death of storytelling, or the death of cinema, or the death of movies, really the death of entertainment. My point is that people seem to selectively be outraged at things when they think that it's socially or politically expedient. The second controversy is surrounding John Michael Higgins' portrayal of the restaurateur who communicates with his Japanese wives by speaking English in an exaggerated, deeply silly Japanese accent. Now, first of all, this is absolutely hilarious because Higgins' character is clearly a moron. But aside from that, should we be offended at a Westerner speaking in an exaggerated Japanese accent? Is it okay if doing so implicitly lampoons the way Japanese people sound when they speak English? Well, my answer is no, we should not be offended, and yes, it's okay. And the reason is because the alternative, the posture of actually being offended, can be quite racist. This issue could be talked about for hours, but I think my favorite philosopher Slavoj Žižek explains it well. His criticism of what some call wokeness, that finds it always necessary to denigrate the Western perspective and blame all global ills on colonialism, is racist in a much more insidious way because the guilty white Western perspective is still maintained as the universal position. Now, what does this mean? So, Zizek tells an anecdote in which he was in a conversation with a bunch of liberal academics and a black person, and after the white liberals got done indicating to that black person that they were deeply ashamed of all the challenges that black people have experienced due to Western imperialism, the black person said, "Hey, wait a second, guys, guess what? Black people can be evil too. We too can make horrendous mistakes." The point is, it's deeply racist to suggest that black people are so childish that they can't even be evil, that any mistakes they make can be swept under the rug in the same way that we forgive kids for saying inappropriate things in public. In this way, white people's performative guilt is just another way of maintaining Western universality. And I think Zizek's insight is really helpful when considering this joke in Licorice Pizza. In the same way that it's deeply racist to suggest that black people are so childish that they can't even be evil, it's also pretty disturbing to suggest that Asian identity is so fragile, inadequate, and vulnerable that they can't even sound silly when they speak English. I studied Chinese in Beijing, and locals always laughed at my ridiculous American accent when speaking Chinese. There's nothing wrong with making fun of my awkwardness during my earnest attempts to speak another language, and there's nothing wrong with doing the same for Asians when they speak English. The impulse to protect certain identity groups from cultural ridicule assumes that their culture is too fragile to withstand it, that it needs to be protected from inane, silly jokes in a movie, and thus it needs the enlightened Western perspective to be offended on their behalf and save them, which is pretty much the colonial perspective in a nutshell. Why are people so eager to be offended? I mean, sometimes it feels like a kind of psychological reflex. Hey, there's an opportunity to get offended, not only to elevate my perceived moral position among my peers, but to fulfill a sense of purpose in making the world a better place. Why are we so willing to suspend any responsibility for interpretation and rush to condemnation based on initial impressions that, to some, should not be carefully considered? Well, that's a deeply complex question and probably the subject for a different video, but I thought I'd share a couple perspectives from thinkers that I respect. For Columbia professor John McWhorter, this is no less than a central tenet of a new religion, one in which indignation is more important than accuracy, and self-mortification as political activism is a form of testimony. It's a religion that's adopted by people who seek purpose in the now purely aestheticized progress of the 1960s that results in a reductive, prosecutorial, and ultimately joyless kind of thinking that turns us all into annoying culture cops. For NYU professor Jonathan Haidt, it's a form of cognitive distortion in which we're socialized to believe our brain's automatic processing or its initial impulses should be taken as gospel rather than controlling the processing like an elephant trainer trains an elephant. He thinks that the framework of cognitive behavioral therapy, a discipline that trains us to be mindful of how our brains process and make sense out of events, should be used as a framework to lift us out of this reactionary and ultimately counterproductive way of thinking. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. This is a movie review after all, and in sum, go see Licorice Pizza. Go experience Licorice Pizza. It's so good. Probably my favorite movie of the year, but I'm still catching up. I actually quite liked The World's Worst Person, or The Worst Person in the World, that Norwegian movie. Be sure to check me out on Twitch. The link is in the description. You guys can come hang with me while I play Elden Ring. I'm going to be doing other stuff on there too. I've got guests. I had Mark Schroeder from previously Earthling Cinema on last week. You guys can ask me anything. I'm doing it Tuesdays, Thursdays, Saturdays, and Sundays at 9 a.m. Pacific time. So be sure to follow me there and subscribe here for more content. And as always, I'll catch you guys next time. Thanks for watching. Peace.